Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Dakota Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1874, a time when Deadwood was nothing more than a lawless mining camp nestled in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. Gold had been discovered in the hills, and the promise of fortune had drawn thousands to this unforgiving wilderness. Among them were the Montgomery sisters. The name Montgomery doesn't appear in any official history of Deadwood. You won't find it in the tourist pamphlets or commemorative plaques that now dot the historic town. Their existence has been methodically erased, their deeds sealed away in forgotten archives and unspoken memories. But for those who know where to look, the whispers remain. In the spring of 1874, Elizabeth and Margaret Montgomery arrived in Deadwood from Boston, Massachusetts. Their arrival was noted briefly in the camp's rudimentary record of new settlers, describing them as two women of proper Eastern bearing seeking establishment of a boarding house. This unassuming entry would be the first in a trail of documents that, when pieced together nearly a century later, would reveal one of the most disturbing series of events in the early history of the American frontier. What made the Montgomery sisters remarkable upon their arrival was not just that they were women traveling alone, though that was unusual enough, but that they came with significant financial resources. In a time when most arrived with little, more than the clothes on their backs and dreams of striking gold, the sisters purchased a sizable plot of land on the eastern edge of the settlement, where the forest began to thicken toward the mountains. Within weeks, they had commissioned the construction of a large two-story house. The builders, mainly Chinese laborers who had come to the area following railroad work, noted in later testimonies that the sisters had very specific requirements for the house. These included an unusually large cellar with a separate entrance. From the outside, thick walls and small high windows that would let in minimal light. According to the builder's journal, recovered in 1965 from his grandson's attic in San Francisco, the sisters were unusually present during construction, inspecting each day's work with meticulous attention. The journal entry, dated May 12, 1874, reads, "The elder Miss M. insisted today on changes to the cellar design, demanded walls of double thickness, and a floor that could be easily lifted in sections. Strange requests for a boarding house, but they pay well and promptly." The boarding house, which they named Montgomery Rest, opened in late June of 1874. It stood apart from the main cluster of Deadwood establishments, requiring visitors to walk a narrow path through a small copse of pine trees. The location offered privacy, the sisters explained to potential boarders, away from the constant noise and debauchery of the mining camps, saloons, and brothels. Their timing was impeccable. The gold rush was bringing a steady stream of prospectors, merchants, and opportunists to Deadwood. Hotel space was scarce, and many were forced to sleep in tents or under wagons. The promise of a clean bed in a proper house, run by two educated Eastern women, was appealing to those with means, particularly those who carried significant gold or currency. According to advertisements placed in the rudimentary Deadwood newsletter of the time, Montgomery Rest offered accommodations of unusual comfort for the discerning traveler and absolute discretion and security for valuables. The rates were considerably higher than other lodging options in the area, but this only added to the exclusive appeal of the establishment. A leather-bound guest book recovered from the ruins of the house in 1962 shows a steady stream of visitors beginning in July 1874. The earliest entries reveal the clientele the sisters attracted: a mining engineer from Pennsylvania, a banker's representative from Chicago, a jewelry merchant from St. Louis, men of means traveling alone, often carrying significant sums. What happened behind the doors of Montgomery Rest would remain largely unknown until 1962, when demolition workers preparing to clear the long-abandoned property for new construction made a grisly discovery. Beneath the rotting floorboards of what had once been the cellar, they found human remains, not of one or two individuals, but of 17. The Dakota Territory Dispatch, a small newspaper serving the region, published a brief article on June 12, 1962, stating only that human remains of undetermined origin and age had been discovered at a construction site in Deadwood. The article noted that authorities were investigating but provided no further details. This would be the only public mention of the discovery for several years. The workers' discovery prompted a formal investigation. The remains were examined by Dr. Harold Jenkins of the South Dakota State Medical Examiner's Office, whose report, dated June 18, 1962, stated, "The skeletal remains appear to be those of adult males, estimated to number 17 distinct individuals. Evidence of trauma is present on 15 of the 17 skulls recovered, consistent with blunt force injury to the posterior cranium." Jenkins's report, filed away in state archives and largely forgotten, noted another disturbing detail. The positioning of the remains suggests they were placed with care rather than discarded haphazardly. Bodies appear to have been arranged in concentric circles, with heads pointing inward toward a central point. This methodical arrangement would later become a point of fascination for criminologists studying the case. Following this discovery, historian Martin Calloway of the University of South Dakota began an extensive research project, tracking down every available record related to the Montgomery sisters and their boarding house. His findings, published in a limited academic journal in 1968, form the basis of what we know today. According to Calloway's research, Elizabeth Montgomery was 32 years old when she arrived in Deadwood, and her sister Margaret was 28. They came from a respected Boston family that had lost its fortune in the financial panic of 1873. Their father, a banker named Thomas Montgomery, had taken his own life following the collapse of his investments, leaving his daughters with only a modest inheritance. Parish records from the Church of the Advent in Boston, where the Montgomery family had been prominent members, show that Thomas Montgomery was denied a proper funeral due to the circumstances of his death. A notation in the church registry, dated November 15, 1873, reads, "Request for funeral rites for T. Montgomery denied by vestry vote. Self-murder cannot be consecrated. Widow and daughters most distressed." This social humiliation, following so closely on financial ruin, appears to have been the catalyst for the sisters' westward journey. Boston newspaper archives contain several mentions of the Montgomery family's fall from grace, including a particularly cruel society column that noted the sisters had been conspicuously absent from the winter social season, with the writer speculating they had wisely removed themselves from circles where they could no longer maintain appearances. What drove the sisters west remains speculative, but Calloway uncovered correspondence between Elizabeth and a cousin in New York, dated February 1874, in which she wrote, "The East offers nothing but memories of our disgrace. We shall seek restoration. Of our fortunes, where new societies are being formed and where our history need not follow us." The journey from Boston to Deadwood in 1874 was arduous, requiring travel by rail to Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, and then by stagecoach through hostile Indian Territory to reach the illegal settlement in the Black Hills. The sisters' presence on this dangerous route was noted in the journal of a freight driver named Samuel Clemens, no relation to the author, who wrote on April 8, 1874, "Two Boston ladies on today's coach to Deadwood, most unusual. They sit straight-backed despite the terrible road, barely speaking, eyes fixed forward. Something in their manner keeps the other passengers at a distance." Poimbah, Montgomery sisters quickly established themselves as respectable business owners in Deadwood. Elizabeth, the elder, handled the business affairs, while Margaret maintained the house and prepared meals for the guests. They attended the camp's makeshift church services on Sundays and were described in multiple accounts as reserved but courteous. A letter from Margaret to their cousin in New York, dated August 1874, provides a carefully crafted image of their new life. Our establishment prospers beyond expectation. The clientele is varied but generally of good quality, primarily gentlemen of business rather than rough miners. We maintain standards that remind our guests of civilization, which they seem to appreciate. Elizabeth's head for figures serves us well in this venture. What no one in Deadwood seemed to question was the unusual turnover rate of guests at Montgomery Rest. In a frontier town where people constantly came and went, perhaps it wasn't remarkable that no guest ever seemed to stay longer than 1 or 2 nights, or that once someone checked into the Montgomery Rest, they were rarely seen in town again. The sisters explained that their clientele was typically passing through, often heading further west after a brief respite from the journey. Given the transient nature of the mining camp's population, no one had reason to doubt this explanation. But according to Calloway's research, a pattern began to emerge. The sisters seemed to select their guests carefully, favoring single men who appeared to have means. A notation in the camp marshal's log from August 1874 recorded a complaint from one prospector who claimed he had been turned away from Montgomery Rest despite vacancies being advertised. The prospector stated that the sisters had told him they were fully booked, yet he had seen no other guests coming or going. The marshal's response, noted simply as "no action warranted," reflects the limited law enforcement of early Deadwood. Before 1876, when the murder of Wild Bill Hickok would bring more formal governance to the camp, Deadwood operated largely without official law. The mining camp existed illegally on Indian land, and residents handled most disputes through informal means. The sisters' business model became clearer through examination of their ledger, recovered from a trunk in the attic of the house in 1962. The ledger, covering the period from June 1874 to November 1875, listed guests by name and room, along with notes about their possessions and apparent wealth. Cryptic symbols appeared next to certain names, which Calloway determined correlated with those individuals whose remains were later found in the cellar. The ledger entries were meticulous, recording not just names and dates, but detailed observations about each guest. An entry from September 1874 reads, "Mr. Howard Brubaker, room 3, one night. Carries bank drafts estimated $1,200, heavy gold watch and chain, mentioned mining investment in Central City, drinks brandy freely, speaks of no family." Beside this entry is a small symbol resembling a circle with a dot at its center. Similar. Symbols appear next to 16 other names throughout the ledger. According to Calloway's analysis, the sisters had developed a calculated system. They would accept only guests who they believed carried significant valuables, gold dust, currency, or jewelry. The guest would be given a room on the second floor, served a dinner that, according to the sisters' purchase records, included significant quantities of laudanum, a commonly available opiate tincture. Once the guest was incapacitated, the sisters would move them to the cellar where, evidence suggests, they would be killed with a blow to the back of the head. Purchase records from Deadwood's only pharmacy, owned by a German immigrant named Friedrich Schiller, show that the Montgomery sisters regularly bought laudanum in quantities far exceeding normal medicinal use. An entry in Schiller's accounts, book dated October 1874, notes, "Miss E. Montgomery, 6,000 laudanum, third such purchase this month. Stated need for persistent female complaint. Recommended consultation with Dr. Mason, which she declined." The sisters would then take possession of all valuables, and the body would be concealed beneath the cellar floor. The system was simple, but effective, made possible by the lawlessness and transience of early Deadwood society. Financial records from the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne show that the sisters made regular deposits throughout 1874 and 1875, always in gold dust, or bank drafts rather than cash. These deposits, totaling thousands of dollars, were listed as income from boarding establishment, raising no suspicions in an era when mining fortunes were made and lost daily. One might wonder how the sisters were able to move grown men from the upper floor to the cellar without assistance. Calloway's research uncovered evidence that the sisters had designed a clever system of pulleys and trapdoors in the house, allowing them to lower unconscious victims directly to the cellar. The architectural plans for the house, recovered from the builder's family in 1965, showed modifications that had been made during construction, including what appeared to be a concealed shaft running from one of the guest rooms to the cellar below. This architectural feature was confirmed in 1963 when a more thorough examination of the ruins of Montgomery Rest was conducted by the South Dakota Historical Society. Their report noted evidence of a narrow shaft, approximately 3 feet by 6 feet, extends from what would have been the floor of room 4 to the cellar. Wooden tracks on the interior walls suggest a mechanism for lowering heavy objects. The shaft had been carefully concealed in the house's structure, with a section of flooring designed to be removed and replaced as needed. The Montgomery sisters operated their deadly boarding house for approximately 17 months, from June 1874 to November 1875. During this time, according to Calloway's estimates, based on the ledger and financial records, they accumulated wealth, equivalent to nearly $300,000 in the currency of the time, a fortune that would be worth millions today. The sisters' operation was not entirely without risk. In March 1875, they faced what appears to have been their closest brush with discovery. The ledger contains an entry for a guest named James Callahan, described as attorney from Denver, overly inquisitive. A notation beside his name reads, claims to represent family of H.B. seeking his whereabouts, mentioned Pinkerton inquiry, situation managed. The H.B. likely refers to Howard Brubaker, the guest mentioned earlier, whose entry was marked with the circle symbol. The reference to a Pinkerton inquiry suggests that Brubaker's disappearance had prompted his family to hire the famous detective agency to investigate. How the sisters managed this situation is not explicitly stated, but Callahan's name appears in the list of those whose remains were found in the cellar. A telegram recovered from the Western Union office, records in Cheyenne, dated April 2nd. 1875, sent to a Denver law firm, reads simply, no trace of Callahan in Deadwood. Believed continued to California. Will advise if appears. The telegram was signed Marshal's Office, Deadwood, though no official marshal had yet been appointed to the camp. Calloway speculates that this telegram was sent by someone impersonating an authority, possibly at the sisters' behest, to derail any further investigation. Their operation came to an end not through discovery of their crimes, but through a decision to leave Deadwood while their fortune and their secret remained intact. In November 1875, the sisters abruptly closed Montgomery Rest, citing Elizabeth's poor health and a desire to return east. They sold the property to a mining company for use as offices, though the building was never actually occupied afterward, and fell into disrepair. The deed of sale recorded in the Territorial Registry shows that the sisters sold the property for a nominal sum, suggesting their primary concern was a quick departure rather than maximizing profit. They left Deadwood on the November 15th stagecoach to Cheyenne, according to the coach company's passenger log. What became of Elizabeth and Margaret Montgomery after they left Deadwood? Calloway traced their journey east through bank records and property deeds. They traveled first to Chicago, where they stayed for several months at the Palmer House Hotel. From there, they moved to New York City, where in 1877 they purchased a townhouse on East 64th Street under the names Elizabeth and Margaret Thornfield. The sisters lived quietly in New York for nearly 20 years, representing themselves as widows who had inherited wealth from their late husbands. They were known for hosting small literary salons and making donations to charitable organizations, particularly those supporting young women's education. There is no evidence that they continued their criminal activities during this period. Social registry entries from New York in the 1880s mention the Thornfield sisters occasionally, describing them as cultured and refined, if somewhat reserved. An entry in the diary of socialite Caroline Astor, dated 1883, notes, "Met the Thornfield sisters at Mrs. Vanderbilt's reception. Unusual women, well-spoken and properly attired, yet something in their manner suggests they are observers rather than participants in our circles. They watch everything with uncommon intensity." Elizabeth died in 1896 of what was recorded as consumption, though private medical records uncovered by Calloway suggested a more complex diagnosis related to a nervous disorder. Margaret lived until 1904, when she passed away from pneumonia. With no children or close relatives, their estate was divided according to their will among several charitable organizations. Their true identity and the source of their wealth remained undiscovered during their lifetimes. The death certificate for Elizabeth, filed with the New York City Department of Health, lists her occupation simply as gentlewoman. A physician's private notes, found among the papers of Dr. Jonathan Pierce, who attended her in her final illness, offer a more complex picture. Miss Thornfield, as she styles herself, exhibits symptoms beyond the physical decline of consumption. She is plagued by periods of acute agitation, during which she speaks of those beneath the floor and expresses fear of judgment. These episodes I attribute to the effects of the disease upon the brain, though her sister intimates they have recurred for many years. The story might have remained buried forever, if not for the 1962 discovery of the remains beneath the old Montgomery rest. Even then, the full account was published only in an obscure academic journal with limited circulation. Calloway's research was never widely disseminated, and the case was quickly overshadowed by more sensational news of the time. But in the dusty archives of the South Dakota Historical Society, the documents remain. The sisters' ledger, with its cryptic markings, the architectural plans with their hidden passages, the medical examiner's report detailing the similar wounds on each skull, and the correspondence that traces the sisters' journey from Boston to Deadwood and beyond. The Montgomery sisters represent a shocking contradiction to the typical narrative of women on the frontier. While history often portrays women in the Wild West as either virtuous settlers or fallen women in brothels, Elizabeth and Margaret created a third category, calculated killers who used the chaos and opportunity of the frontier to enrich themselves through methodical murder. Dr. Elaine Harper, a criminologist who studied the case in the 1980s, noted in her analysis, "The Montgomery sisters exploit a significant blind spot in both historical record and criminal justice. Female killers who target adult male victims operate with a levels of invisibility that their male counterparts cannot achieve. The sisters understood this intuitively, weaponizing Victorian assumptions about female capability and nature. What drove two educated women from a respectable Boston family to such extremes? Calloway's research offers some clues. The financial ruin of their family and their father's suicide left them not only without resources, but also socially ostracized in status-conscious Boston society. Letters between the sisters, found among their effects after Margaret's death, reveal a deep bitterness about their fall from social grace and a determination to reclaim their position by any means necessary. In one letter dated January 1874, just before their departure west, Margaret wrote to Elizabeth, Society has shown us that worth is measured only in dollars, not in character. If we are to be judged solely by our possessions, then let us acquire them in whatever manner is available to us. The world has made its rules clear. Elizabeth's response, dated a week later, shows a colder, more calculating perspective. We have been granted a singular freedom, dear sister. With father gone and our name tarnished, we are effectively invisible. No one of consequence watches women such as we have become. In this lies opportunity, if we have the courage to seize it. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Montgomery case is how effectively the sisters used societal expectations about women to mask their criminal activities. In the rough environment of Deadwood, two refined Eastern women running a respectable boarding house were above suspicion. Their victims, primarily men traveling alone with wealth, were unlikely to be missed immediately, if at all. The sisters had identified a perfect environment for their crimes. The house itself no longer stands. After the discovery in 1962 and the subsequent investigation, the remains of the structure were demolished. A small office building now occupies the site, with no marker or indication of what once occurred there. Few residents of modern Deadwood are aware of the Montgomery sisters or their crimes. But in 1966, during an oral history project conducted by the South Dakota Historical Society, an elderly resident of Deadwood named Harold Finch, who had been a child in the 1880s, recalled stories told about the old Montgomery house. Nobody would go near it after the sisters left. Folks said the ground around it was poisoned. Nothing would grow there. Even the animals stayed away. People would cross to the other side of the path rather than walk directly past it. Nobody ever said why exactly, it was just understood. Finch's testimony suggests that despite the lack of formal accusations or investigations, the residents of Deadwood may have harbored suspicions about the Montgomery sisters and their boarding house. The collective avoidance of the property after their departure indicates a form of unspoken community knowledge, a sense that something was wrong with the place, even if no one articulated exactly what. Another resident interviewed for the same project, Abigail Thornton, who had worked as a laundress in early Deadwood, offered this recollection. Those sisters, they kept to themselves mostly. Very particular about their linens, wanted everything washed separate from other folks' things. I remember once finding a stain, a dark, rusty stain, on a sheet from their house. When I mentioned it, the younger one got this look in her eye that made my blood run cold. Said I was mistaken, must have mixed up their linens with someone else's. Paid me extra that week. I never mentioned stains again. The most chilling aspect of the Montgomery case is perhaps not the murders themselves, but how completely the sisters escaped justice and nearly escaped historical record altogether. Had construction workers not uncovered the remains in 1962, the 17 men who died at Montgomery Rest might never have been known. Their names, recorded in the sisters' ledger, but nowhere else, would have remained as vanished travelers in Lois, a frontier town where disappearances were common and rarely investigated. In the years following Calloway's research, several writers and historians attempted to expand on his findings, but little additional information has come to light. In 1970, an article in a national magazine briefly mentioned the case, leading to a short-lived interest in the story. However, without sensational details or living participants, public attention quickly waned. A review of territorial records conducted in the 1970s by graduate students at the University of Wyoming uncovered one additional piece of evidence: a letter from Elizabeth Montgomery to the territorial governor, dated October 1875, requesting permission to transport a collection of scientific specimens east without inspection. The nature of these specimens was not specified, but the timing of the letter just weeks before the sisters left Deadwood raises disturbing possibilities. The governor's response, if there was one, has not been found. In 1983, criminologist Dr. Elaine Harper published a paper analyzing the Montgomery case from a psychological perspective, suggesting that the sisters represented an extremely rare example of female serial killers operating as a team. Harper noted the methodical nature of their crimes, the clear financial motivation, and the effective use of gender expectations as a cover. She classified them as organized, profit-motivated killers rather than the more common profile of killers driven by psychological compulsion or trauma. Harper's analysis points to Elizabeth as the dominant partner in the relationship, the architect of their criminal enterprise, with Margaret as the more hesitant but ultimately compliant accomplice. This dynamic is supported by the sisters' correspondence, in which Elizabeth consistently takes a more assertive tone, while Margaret occasionally expresses doubts or concerns. What makes the Montgomery case particularly significant in the study of historical crimes is how it challenges our understanding of frontier justice and society. The lawlessness of early Deadwood created an environment where two women could murder at least 17 men over the course of a year and a half without raising suspicion. The transient nature of the population, the focus on individual survival and fortune-seeking, and the limited law enforcement resources all contributed to creating a perfect environment for predators like the Montgomery sisters. The case also raises questions about how we record and remember history. The story of the Montgomery sisters does not fit neatly into the established narratives of the American West. It is neither a tale of hardy pioneers nor of flamboyant outlaws. It is something darker, more complex, and perhaps more threatening to our collective understanding of the past. As a result, it has been largely forgotten, relegated to academic footnotes rather than popular history. In 1988, during renovation of the East 64th Street townhouse in New York, where the sisters had lived their later years, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the master bedroom. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, apparently belonging to Margaret Montgomery. The journal, now held in the New York Historical Society archives, contains mostly mundane entries about social engagements and household matters. However, a few passages suggest that Margaret at least felt some weight from their crimes. In an entry dated December 25, 1887, she wrote, "Another Christmas passed in comfort and security. Elizabeth says we should feel only satisfaction in our circumstances, given the alternative." Perhaps she is right. Yet I find myself looking at the faces of strangers on the street and wondering if they are searching for someone who passed through our doors in that distant place. E says such thoughts are dangerous and unnecessary. The past is buried, quite literally. A later entry, dated April 10, 1888, reads, "Attended Mrs. Hawkins's salon today. Discussion turned to the subject of frontier justice and lawlessness in the territories. Senator Miller's wife spoke at length about the necessary violence of taming the wilderness. If only they knew what violence truly accomplishes. It has tamed us, given us this life of perfect respectability." The thought nearly made me laugh aloud, which E would never forgive. This rare glimpse into Margaret's thoughts suggests a complex psychological relationship with their crimes, not necessarily remorse, but an awareness of the weight of what they had done. Elizabeth, it seems from this and other entries, was the harder of the two sisters, more committed to their course of action, and less troubled by its implications. In one of the final entries in the journal, dated just months before Elizabeth's death in 1896, Margaret wrote, "E's health fails rapidly now. She speaks increasingly of our time in D, not with regret, but with a strange pride. We did what men have always done," she told me yesterday. "We saw opportunity, and we took it without hesitation. That is the American way, is it not?" I could not argue, though I wonder if our father would recognize the daughters he raised. Following Elizabeth's death, Margaret appears to have withdrawn further from society. The few records of her final years showed decreased participation in the social events that had been a regular part of the sisters' New York life. Her own journal entries become sparse and primarily concerned with health complaints and household matters. The last dated entry, from January 1903, a year before her death, reads simply, "I dreamed of the house last night, not as it was, but as it must be now, fallen in upon itself, returning to the earth, and beneath it those others also returning to the earth. Perhaps in time all will be cleansed. But I wonder, what becomes of souls purchased with blood money? Are mine and ease already spoken for?" The story of the Montgomery sisters remains largely unknown outside academic circles and specialized true crime research. Yet it represents a fascinating counter-narrative to traditional histories of the American West, particularly regarding the role of women. While most historical accounts focus on the men who shaped the frontier through violence, outlaws, lawmen, soldiers, and vigilantes, the Montgomery sisters reveal that women, too, could use the chaotic frontier environment to their advantage, turning societal expectations into weapons. In 1992, a small collection of letters was donated to the South Dakota Historical Society by the descendants of Martha Collins, who had been one of the few female residents of early Deadwood. Among these was a letter dated October 1875, just before the Montgomery sisters left the settlement. Collins wrote to her sister in St. Louis, "The Montgomery women announced yesterday they will be returning east before winter. There is much I could say about those two, but perhaps it is better left unwritten. Some things, once spoken, cannot be unheard. I will say only this. I have never met women who smiled so pleasantly while their eyes remained so cold. May Providence judge them appropriately, for I doubt earthly justice ever shall." This cryptic statement suggests that at least some in Deadwood may have harbored suspicions about the sisters, even if no formal accusations were ever made. The frontier code of minding one's own business, particularly when it came to people of apparent means and refinement, may have prevented such suspicions from becoming public discourse. Another letter in the Collins collection, dated December 1875 after the sisters' departure, mentions that the Montgomery house stands empty now, and none seem eager to claim it despite the good location. It carries a shadow about it that even the brightest day cannot dispel. Some say they hear sounds from within, though the place is surely vacant. I pass it daily and feel only a deep chill, as if winter has settled there permanently. The references to sounds and shadows could be dismissed as frontier superstition, but they align with Harold Finch's later recollection that the property was avoided by the residents of Deadwood. Something about the house disturbed the community, even if they could not or would not articulate the specific cause of their unease. The Montgomery Rest case represents one of the most successful series of murders in American history, not just in terms of the number of victims or the wealth acquired, but in how completely the perpetrators escaped both legal consequences and historical reckoning. The sisters lived out their lives in comfort and respectability, their dark secret known only to themselves. As we look back at this disturbing chapter in the history of the American frontier, we are left with more questions than answers. How many other crimes remain buried in the foundations of our towns and cities, their perpetrators having lived and died without facing justice? How many missing persons throughout history vanished not through accident or misadventure, but at the hands of calculating killers like the Montgomery sisters? The old site of Montgomery Rest in Deadwood holds no memorial for the 17 men who died there. Their names, recorded only in the sisters' ledger, represent a diverse cross-section of frontier society: miners from Cornwall and Ireland, merchants from the eastern states, a doctor from Germany, a lawyer from Chicago, men who came west seeking fortune and opportunity, only to find their journeys ended in a respectable boarding house run by two proper Boston ladies. According to Calloway's research, attempts to identify the remains and notify descendants were largely unsuccessful. The passage of time, nearly 90 years, and the transient nature of the victims made tracing their families virtually impossible. The remains were eventually reburied in a common grave in Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, the same cemetery where Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane lie buried, though without the prominent markers that denote their graves. In a final twist to this macabre tale, Calloway's research notes, archived at the University of South Dakota, contain reference to one last piece of evidence that has never been located. According to several sources he interviewed, the sisters commissioned a portrait shortly before leaving Deadwood in November 1875. The portrait, reportedly painted by a traveling artist who spent several days at Montgomery Rest, depicted the sisters standing before their boarding house. One source, a woman who had worked briefly as a laundress for the Montgomerys, claimed to have seen the portrait just before it was packed for transport east. She described it to Calloway as troubling in a way I cannot fully express. They stood so proper and dignified, like true ladies. But the artist had captured something in their expressions, a coldness, a hardness behind the eyes. And strangest of all, though it must have been a trick of the light or the paint, the ground beneath their feet in the portrait appeared to be soaked with darkness, as if the very earth was stained. The portrait, if it ever existed, has never been found. Perhaps it hangs unrecognized in some private collection, the identities of the subjects long forgotten. Or perhaps, like so many other pieces of evidence relating to the Montgomery sisters, it has been deliberately destroyed, erasing one more connection to their crimes. An inventory of the sisters' New York possessions, conducted after Margaret's death in 1904, lists various artworks, but provides no specific description of a portrait matching the one described. The disposition of these artworks is not recorded, though most of the sisters' possessions were apparently sold at auction, with the proceeds going to the charitable organizations named in Margaret's will. A search of auction records from 1904-1905 by art historian Patricia Landers in the early 1990s found no clear reference to such a portrait, though she did locate a catalog entry for a portrait of two ladies in frontier setting, artist unknown, American School, circa 1875. The painting was purchased by an anonymous buyer, and its current whereabouts, if it still exists, are unknown. As night falls over modern Deadwood, now a tourist destination where visitors can experience a sanitized version of Wild West history, few who walk its streets know the story of Elizabeth and Margaret Montgomery. Their boarding house is gone. Their victims long buried elsewhere after the 1962 discovery, their names absent from historical markers and tour guides' narratives. But beneath the surface of the town's history, like the bodies hidden beneath the cellar floor, their story remains, a reminder that the frontier's lawlessness created opportunities not just for the stereotypical male outlaws of Western lore, but for predators of all kinds. In the case of the Montgomery sisters, the mask of respectability, combined with the era's assumptions about women's capabilities, created the perfect cover for one of the most successful and least known killing sprees in American history. Locally, historian Richard Simmons, who has studied Deadwood's history for over 40 years, notes, "We remember Wild Bill and Calamity Jane because they fit our image of the Wild West. They're colorful, larger than life. The Montgomery sisters don't fit the narrative we've created about our past. They're too disturbing, too contrary to how we want to think about women in that era. But their story tells us something important about the reality of frontier life, that the appearance of civilization could mask the darkest of intentions." The archived materials relating to the Montgomery case were last accessed by researchers in 1994, according to the South Dakota Historical Society's records. Since then, they have remained largely forgotten, gathering dust in storage facilities. As interest in the case waned, The academic journal in which Calloway published his findings ceased publication in 1972, and the few copies in existence are held mainly by university libraries specializing in Western American history. And so the Montgomery sisters nearly achieved in death what they so carefully cultivated in life: anonymity for their crimes, their names unattached to the horrors they committed, their respectability intact. Only the chance discovery of human remains nearly a century after their crimes prevented their victims from remaining forever unnamed and unaccounted for. In 2002, during renovation of an old building that had once housed Deadwood's Western Union office, workers discovered a cache of unsent telegrams from the 1870s, apparently set aside due to disputes over payment or illegibility. Among them was a partially damaged message dated October 1875, signed only with the initial M. The telegram addressed to Boston read, "Cannot continue. The sounds beneath the floor grow louder each night." E says imagination only, perhaps. Returning east will silence them. God forgive what we have. The message ends abruptly, the remainder torn away or decayed with age. Forensic document specialists who examined the telegram noted that the handwriting matches samples of Margaret Montgomery's script found in the guest ledger, suggesting that the younger sister may have had moments of doubt or remorse about their actions. That the telegram was never sent may indicate that Elizabeth discovered it before transmission, further evidence of the elder sister's controlling nature and determination to continue their course. This telegram, now preserved in the Deadwood Historical Museum's archives, represents one of the few direct pieces of evidence suggesting that either sister experienced anything resembling guilt for their crimes. The reference to sounds beneath the floor could be interpreted as literal, perhaps the settling of the house or the natural processes of decomposition, or as a metaphorical expression of Margaret's troubled conscience. Psychologist Dr. Rachel Winters, who studied the Montgomery case in 2010, suggests that the relationship between the sisters represents a psychological phenomenon known as folie à deux, a shared psychosis in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one individual to another. In this interpretation, Elizabeth's pathological response to their social and financial downfall, her belief that they were entitled to restore their fortunes by any means necessary, gradually transferred to the initially more hesitant Margaret. Elizabeth appears to have been the primary driver of their criminal enterprise, Dr. Winters wrote in her analysis. The available evidence suggests Margaret experienced moments of doubt or moral conflict which Elizabeth systematically suppressed. Over time, Margaret's resistance weakened, and she became a fully complicit partner. The telegram represents a rare moment where her independent moral voice briefly reasserted itself only to be silenced again. This pattern is consistent with other documented cases of criminal partnerships, particularly those involving family members. The stronger personality gradually erodes the moral boundaries of the weaker, creating a closed system in which external ethical standards cease to apply. In the isolated environment of the frontier, far from the social constraints of their former lives, this process would have been accelerated and intensified. A previously overlooked entry in Margaret's New York Journal, identified by researchers in 2005, seems to support this interpretation. Dated March 1889, the entry reads, "Had the dream again. I'm standing at the top of the stairs in D, watching as E directs the placement of another beneath the floor. In the dream, I try to speak, to say it must stop, but no words come. E looks up at me, her face calm as always, and says, 'It is too late to develop a conscience, Margaret. We crossed that line long ago.' And in the dream, as in life, I turn away and return to my duties, the making of the beds, the preparation of the next meal, the laying of the next trap." The matter-of-fact tone of this dream recollection, recorded 14 years after the sisters left Deadwood, suggests that Margaret had internalized their crimes to the point where they could be described without evident emotional distress, yet the recurrence of the dream indicates that, on some level, her subconscious continued to process what they had done. An interesting counterpoint to the psychological analysis comes from the work of economic historian Dr. Sarah Jameson, who in 2012 examined the Montgomery case through the lens of frontier capitalism. Jameson argues that the sisters' actions, while extreme, represent a dark extension of the exploitative economic practices that characterize the development of the American West. The Montgomery sisters operated in an environment where human life was routinely devalued in pursuit of profit, Jameson writes. Mining companies sacrificed workers in dangerous conditions. Land speculators defrauded settlers. Indigenous populations were displaced and destroyed. The sisters simply took this implicit value system to its logical, if horrifying, conclusion: direct predation for financial gain. Jameson points out that the sisters' successful reintegration into respectable society in New York using wealth built on murder parallels the experience of many robber barons of the Gilded Age who accumulated fortunes through practices that, while not homicidal, often involved exploitation and corruption. American society, she argues, has always been more interested in the fact of wealth than its source. This economic interpretation adds another dimension to our understanding of the Montgomery sisters, not as aberrations, but as extreme expressions of the darker aspects of American expansion and capitalism. Their gender and superficial adherence to social norms allowed them to operate undetected, but their underlying motivation, the accumulation of wealth regardless of human cost, was not fundamentally different from impulses that drove much of Western development. The Montgomery sisters' legacy extends beyond their immediate crimes to raise questions about how we remember and memorialize the past. Deadwood today celebrates its outlaw history, with tourists visiting the site of Wild Bill Hickok's murder and Calamity Jane's grave. The violence of the frontier is packaged as entertainment, sanitized and romanticized for popular consumption. Yet the violence perpetrated by the Montgomery sisters remains largely unacknowledged. No historical marker indicates where their boarding house once stood. No tour guide points out the site where 17 men met their deaths. Their story is excluded from the official narrative of Deadwood's past, perhaps because it contradicts the gendered assumptions that underpin our understanding of frontier violence. In 2015, local historian Mary Simmons proposed a small memorial plaque at the site of Montgomery Rest, honoring the unidentified victims. The proposal was rejected by the Deadwood Historical Commission, with one member reportedly commenting that the story was too uncertain and might create a false impression of Deadwood's history. This decision raises important questions about which aspects of the past we choose to remember and commemorate, and which we allow to fade into obscurity. The story of the Montgomery sisters challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about gender, violence, and opportunity on the American frontier. It reminds us that predatory behavior was not exclusively male, that the refined could be as deadly as the rough, and that beneath the surface of respectable society, darkness could flourish undetected. As you leave this narrative behind and return to your world, perhaps take a moment to consider the buildings around you, the ground beneath your feet, the history that lies just below the surface of the places you know. For as the Montgomery sisters proved, history is not always what is recorded and remembered. Sometimes it is what has been deliberately forgotten, buried, and left unspoken. And perhaps, if you ever find yourself in Deadwood, walking along the eastern edge of town where the forest begins to thicken toward the mountains, pause for a moment on the spot where Montgomery Rest once stood. The building is gone, and no marker commemorates what happened there. But something of those events remains in that place, not a ghost story or supernatural presence, but something more profound, the knowledge that human nature contains depths, darker than any mine shaft, and that the true history of the American frontier includes predators who wore not gun belts and bandanas, but corsets and cameo brooches. The investigation into the Montgomery sisters' crimes never fully closed. In 2018, forensic anthropologist Dr. Linda Harrison obtained permission to examine the remains recovered from beneath Montgomery Rest, which had been preserved in the South Dakota State University's anthropology collection after their initial analysis in 1962. Using modern techniques unavailable to the original investigators, Dr. Harrison was able to extract additional information about the victims. Her findings, published in the Journal of Forensic Anthropology, confirmed Dr. Jenkins's original assessment that the victims were all adult males, ranging in age from approximately 25 to 60 years. More significantly, her analysis revealed evidence of restraint prior to death in at least 12 of the 17 individuals, with ligature marks visible on wrist bones and, in some cases, ankles. This suggests that the victims were not simply killed while unconscious from drugged food or drink, Dr. Harrison wrote. Many were apparently restrained, possibly for some period of time before their deaths. This adds a new dimension to our understanding of the crimes, indicating a level of interaction between the killers and victims that previous researchers had not identified. DNA analysis of the remains proved less informative. The age of the bones and conditions of their storage limited the genetic information that could be extracted. However, isotope analysis of teeth and bone samples provided some insight into the geographical origins of the victims. Several showed isotope patterns consistent with European birth, supporting the ledger entries that identified some victims as recent immigrants. Others indicated origins in the eastern United States. One victim, identified in the ledger as Dr. A. Schmidt, showed dental work consistent with European training, supporting the ledger's description of him as a physician from Munich. The attention to such details in the ledger suggests that the sisters took care to accurately record information about their victims, perhaps as a way of maintaining control over their narrative even after death. Dr. Harrison's research also uncovered another disturbing aspect of the crimes, evidence that at least 3 of the victims had survived for some time after receiving initial injuries. These individuals showed signs of partial healing around fractures, indicating they had lived for days or possibly weeks after being seriously wounded. This finding correlates with a previously overlooked entry in the sisters' ledger, where next to the name Mr. Patrick Donovan appears the notation, "Resistant to usual method, relocated to lower level for extended observation, ceased after 4 days." The clinical language masks what was apparently a prolonged death, with the victim held captive in the cellar while the sisters continued operating their boarding house above. Such discoveries force us to reconsider the Montgomery sisters not merely as opportunistic killers, but as individuals capable of sustained cruelty, watching a man slowly die while continuing their daily routines of making beds and preparing meals for new guests. This calculated detachment represents a particular kind of horror, one that exists not in supernatural threats or momentary violence, but in the methodical application of harm over time. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Montgomery sisters is not what they did, but how easily they did it, and how completely they escaped the consequences. Their story is a reminder that justice is not inevitable, that crimes can go unpunished, that the guilty can live out their lives in comfort while their victims lie forgotten. It is a cold reality of human existence, as true today as it was in the lawless mining camps of the 1870s. The Montgomery sisters took their secrets to their graves in New York's Woodlawn Cemetery, where they lie buried under the name Thornfield, their true identity known only to themselves. The 17 men whose lives they took in pursuit of restored fortune have no such marked resting place. Their remains, after examination by the medical examiner in 1962, were buried in a common grave in Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, their individual identities lost to time. In 2020, forensic genealogist Emma Richardson began attempting to identify the victims through a combination of historical research and DNA analysis. Working with limited genetic material from the remains and cross-referencing with the names in the ledger, she has been searching for descendants of men reported missing in the Deadwood area during 1874-1875. These were real people with families and futures, Richardson stated in an interview. They deserve to be more than anonymous victims in a historical footnote. Each man who walked into Montgomery Rest had a story that was cut short. By identifying them, we restore some measure of their humanity and perhaps provide closure to families who never knew what happened to their ancestors. To date, Richardson has made preliminary identifications of 3 victims: Howard Brubaker, a Philadelphia banker's agent who disappeared while assessing mining investments; Carl Schmidt, a German physician who had immigrated to America following the Franco-Prussian War; and James Callahan, the Denver attorney who was investigating Brubaker's disappearance on behalf of his family. These identifications, while not definitive, represent the first steps toward restoring names and histories to the victims. Richardson's work continues, though funding limitations and the challenges of tracing genealogical connections across nearly 150 years make progress slow. It's like assembling a puzzle where most of the pieces have been deliberately destroyed, she explains, but even identifying a few of these men helps us understand the human cost of what happened at Montgomery Rest. The story of the Montgomery sisters has occasionally inspired works of fiction, though few capture the cold calculation that characterized their actual crimes. A 1995 novel titled The Boarding House used elements of the case but added supernatural components entirely absent from the historical record. A 2008 independent film, Sisters of Fortune, took similar liberties, portraying the Montgomerys as victims of abuse seeking revenge against male oppressors, a narrative unsupported by any historical evidence. These fictionalized accounts perhaps reflect our difficulty in confronting the reality of the Montgomery sisters, that their violence was not driven by trauma or supernatural influence, but by a calculated decision to restore their financial and social position through murder. Their story lacks the elements that might make it more palatable or comprehensible. No childhood abuse, no psychotic break, no revenge motive. Just a cold assessment of opportunity and advantage carried out with methodical precision. As historians, Karen Johnson noted in a 2019 article on the case, the Montgomery sisters represent a challenge to our gendered understanding of violence. We have cultural frameworks for understanding male violence, particularly on the frontier. But female violence of this calculated nature doesn't fit our historical narratives. Perhaps this is why their story has been so consistently marginalized or altered in retelling, and so the story ends, not with justice or resolution, but with silence, the same silence that has surrounded the Montgomery sisters and their crimes for nearly 150 years. A silence broken only by those who, like us, choose to remember, to speak the unspoken, to acknowledge that sometimes the most terrifying monsters in human history are not those who operate outside society's bounds, but those who use society's expectations as their most effective disguise. The Montgomery sisters of Deadwood. Remember their names? For few others do. In a final haunting detail uncovered during Calloway's original research but omitted from his published findings due to lack of corroboration, a former guest of Montgomery Rest, who had stayed there in early 1875 but left quickly after only one night, reported decades later. There was something wrong with that place. The sisters were proper ladies in every visible way, but I couldn't sleep. Kept hearing what sounded like scratching coming from beneath my floor. When I mentioned it at breakfast, the elder sister, Elizabeth, I believe, smiled so coldly it chilled my blood. She said, "The house settles at night, sir, nothing more." But then she exchanged a look with her sister that decided me. I made an excuse about urgent business elsewhere and left within the hour. Something told me that if I stayed another night, I might never leave at all. This account, given in 1925 by William Hargrove, then an elderly banker in St. Louis, was recorded by his grandson but never published. The manuscript was discovered among Calloway's personal papers after his death in 1975. Whether Hargrove was an accurate witness after 50 years is impossible to determine, but his story suggests that at least one potential victim may have sensed the danger in time to escape. If Hargrove's account is true, it raises the question of how many others might have felt similar unease but dismissed their instincts, remaining at Montgomery Rest to become part of the grim tally beneath the floorboards. It reminds us that the boundary between safety and danger can be as thin as a wooden floor, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless. The Montgomery sisters exploited the particular vulnerabilities of their time and place, a frontier town where people appeared and disappeared daily, where law enforcement was minimal, where a woman's capacity for violence was unimaginable to most. Their crimes were made possible by specific historical circumstances, yet they speak to timeless aspects of human nature. The capacity for calculated cruelty, the mask of respectability, the willingness to value wealth and status above human life. Perhaps what makes their story so disturbing is not its strangeness, but its familiarity, the recognition that similar calculations and moral compromises continue to shape human actions, albeit usually in less dramatic forms. The Montgomery sisters may have operated in the lawless context of the 1870s frontier, but the impulses that drove them remain recognizable in our own time. And so we leave them here, Elizabeth and Margaret Montgomery, proper Boston ladies turned methodical killers, their respectability restored through blood money, their crimes nearly lost to history. Their story serves as a dark reminder that history's monsters do not always announce themselves with obvious menace, that evil can wear a pleasant smile and pour tea from a fine china pot, that beneath the floorboards of civilized society, unspeakable things may lie hidden. The Montgomery sisters of Deadwood, their story is told. Their crimes are known. May their victims rest in peace.